Hi everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. This week we're going to be talking for the second week in a row about miut, meaning statistical minorities in Halakha. Last week we started this conversation because in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Daf Lamitalan Amabet and on Daf Mem Amabet, there was a conversation about the Shita of Rabbi Meir, the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir does not think that we should always follow the rove, that we should always follow the statistical majority. He sometimes thinks that we should follow the statistical minority, the miut. And we don't really hold that way, la halacha, but it was certainly interesting to understand what was behind it. And we actually looked at something that might have been behind it is perhaps that sometimes a miut might look a little bit more likely if there's a legal presumption in there that supports it. But if you want to know more about that, go back to week 1. I want to talk about week 2 because for all that I said that we do not follow Rabbi Meir, la halacha, and instead we follow the rove, even by the way, if there's a legal presumption against that rove, it turns out that there are some places in halacha where it does seem like we are concerned about the statistical minority of cases. The most concrete and frequent example, I think, for most people is having to check your vegetables for bugs. Why do we check our vegetables for bugs? A majority of those vegetables do not grow, they're not going to have bugs on them. A majority. Why are we even concerning ourselves with that? That's not a statistical majority. That's not rove. That's miut. So it turns out that there's a concept called miut HaMatzui, or miut deshchicha, a prevalent statistical minority. And I want to look into that concept today because it sure does sound like that means we are poskening like Rabbi Meir. I also want to look into that concept because it seems to kind of undermine our whole concept of following the rove. So let's jump in and take a look at what is going on with a miut HaMatzui. A really helpful example for miut HaMatzui is actually the example of checking an animal after you shecht it to see if it was a treifa. Now, just to remind ourselves, a nevela is an animal that didn't have shechita. It died without being slaughtered. A treifa, however, is an animal that even if it was slaughtered, it turns out it had a mortal wound beforehand. And therefore, even though it was slaughtered, it's not a kosher animal. Now, do I have to actually check if I slaughter an animal? Do I have to actually check if it has any of the possible blemishes that could cause an animal to be a treifa? Especially given that these are blemishes that generally are on the inside, like a punctured lung, right? Do I actually have to check that? Or do we say, well, most animals probably don't have those blemishes, so we don't even have to check? So the Gemara seems to say, we're going to follow the rove, we're going to follow the majority. Here goes the Gemara in Chulin. Rav Huna says, Behema b'chayeha b'cheskat isser omedet. When an animal is alive, it is presumed legally to be usher to eat, right? Because that would be Ever min achai. Ashiva dalacha b'men nishchata, until you know that it was slaughtered. What about nishchata? What about an animal that has been slaughtered? That is b'cheskat heter omedet. That is legally presumed to be mutar to eat, to be allowed to eat. Ashiva dalacha b'metr nitrafa, until you find out that it has it has one of the simane tarfut, right? It has one of the blemishes that was a mortal wound, right? So this is really interesting because what we have here is a legal presumption that a shechted animal is kosher, right? That it's not a treifa until otherwise said. Now, I'm going to add here, it's also most animals are not treifas. So if that's the case as well, you not only have a legal presumption that it was shechted, you also have the rove that there's no tarfut. So sounds like you don't even have to check, right? So the Gemara continues and says, it's strange. The language that was used here was it says it's becheskat heter omedet. It has a legal presumption of mutar. The Gemara says belema nishchita hutra. Why doesn't it say if it was shechted, if it was slaughtered, it's permitted to be eaten? Why becheskat heter? So hakamash malan, what is it trying to teach us? The afagav de itilid ba reisa. Not only do we think that it is considered in the presumptive status of mutar to eat, if there's nothing making us think otherwise, but even if there's something that actually seems to have dinged its status. For example, Kidabai mine Rabbi Abba me Rav Huna, as Rabbi Abba asked Rav Huna, Ba'ze'ev v'natal b'nei me'ayim mahu. Let's say you shechted an animal, and then a wolf came and grabbed the entrails of the animal. Do you have to worry that the animal is somehow not kosher, that maybe it was a treifa, you didn't even get to look at the innards? So the Gemara says, wait, not all. If they took it, haletnu, it's not here, right? We're not, you can't even check it, right? So the Gemara says, no. Ella nikev b'nei me'ayin mahu. Let's say a wolf came and perforated the intestines, which, by the way, would make something a treifa. If it had been perforated before the shechita, it would be a treifa. What if now you see the wolf perforated it after? So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Nikev, the fact that it perforated it, hakachazinan dehu nakvinhu. What do you mean? We saw that this perforation wasn't from before the shechita. Of course, it's not a treifa. We just saw the ze'ev do it now. So it says, no. What about the following case? Ella nitalan v'hechziran kishein nikuvin mahu. What happens is you shecht an animal, a wolf comes and grabs the entrails, takes the entrails away. When it brings the entrails back, it has perforations, which is a siman of being a treifa. So what do we do? Mi chayshinan shema b'makom nekev nikev. Do we think that maybe where the holes are right now that the ze'ev made, maybe there was already a hole there before? Oh, no. Or do we not? Right? And the Gemara answers from Rav Huna. Amarle Rav Huna says, Ein choshishin shema b'makom nekev nikev. We do not assume that the perforations that you see were, just the bite marks or scratch marks of the ze'ev were over marks that were already there. We assume that they're new. In other words, even in a situation where there's something that might make you think that it's possible that it might have been a treifa before, even then we say, nope, we're not worried about it, right? The chazaka, the presumption, and I would say the majority of animals that don't have that problem, right? Sounds like you don't have to check. Now, what I think is absolutely fascinating is why then does the Shulchan Aruch say, Ein tzarich livdok achar shum treifot min hastam? You do not have to check any of the simanei treifut. You do not have to check for any mortal blemishes, by default. Chutz min hareya, except for the lung. Tzarich livdok bebehema b'chaya. You actually do have to check the lungs. Why? Or not why, for what? Im yesh basircha. We're worried if they might have an adhesion that's a tear, which would make it a treifa. V'chol haporitz geder le'achol b'lo b'dika yishchenu nachash. And anybody who literally breaks through the fence, meaning transgresses this, a snake should bite them, meaning they should get punished. In other words, wait a second. You just told me we assume there's a chazaka, a presumption that the animal is kosher because it was shechted. I'm adding most animals are not going to have adhesions that are tears on their lungs. And yet we have to check. Doesn't that sound like we're being choshesh lemiut? Doesn't that sound like we are actually taking into account halachically the statistical minority? I'll say even, more so when you see there's even in if bet there. What happens if you didn't actually get to check it? Can you eat it anyway? So look at this. Misha kara beten habehema, bekodem shetibade kareya. And if somebody tears open the inside of the animal that was shechted, and before the lung is checked, ba'kelev ove kochavim unetala, a dog or someone who's a pagan came and took it, v'halachlo, and left with the lung, meaning you never got to check it, harezo muteret, right? So the Shulchan Aruch paskins, it's okay. If you couldn't check it, it's okay, right? Which is interesting in and of itself, because maybe if you were Rabbi Meir would have said, well, if you can't check it, we still have to worry about the possibility, the minority statistic that it's possible that this thing is actually a treifa. But here, if you can't check it, it's okay. We don't say, well, there is a minority possibility that this thing might have had a perforation or an adhesion that amounted to making it a treifa. But then the Rama adds, v'yesh machmirin, and there are some people who are strict. Im ne'evda hareya, if the lung got lost. Ve'ein lahatir rak b'makom hefsed gadol. And you're not allowed to allow people to eat it unless there is a great financial strain, a great financial loss. But if you can't check it anymore because it's gone, unless there's a great financial loss, we are worried about the miyut, right? Or, by the way, o begidim, mutlaim, v'chayot, or if it's certain kinds of animals, she'ein sirchot mitzuyot behem, because they don't really get these kinds of adhesions. So it sounds like in this case, there's a machloket clearly, but at the very least, if you can check, you have to check, even though it's the miyut of cases. If you can't check, looks like there's a machloket. But I want to understand this miyut HaMatzui stuff. This is even a miyut that's going against a chazaka that it's kosher and a rove that most things don't have this. I'm not even sure Rabbi Meir would say that you have to look at these things. Rabbi Meir doesn't say that if a miyut is going against both a rove and a chazaka, that you're worried about the miyut. So this is really interesting. So what makes something a miyut HaMatzui, a prevalent miyut? So it turns out, of course, there's a machloket on the issue. And I think it's interesting to look at two different approaches that are sort of the anchor approaches, and then other people add things in between. But the anchor approaches are basically the Rivash and the Mishkanot Yaakov. The Rivash, 14th century, Rav Yitzchak ben Sheshet Barfet, and the Mishkanot Yaakov, 19th century, Rav Yaakov ben Aaron of Karlin. The Rivash says it has to be close to 50% in order to be a miyut HaMatzui. Now, that I really understand, right? He says in number 4, Shemiyut HaMatzui Ritzon Lamar Shehu Karov Lamechza. A miyut HaMatzui is something that happens almost 50% of the time. The Ragil Hiyot, it's something that really happens on the regular. Dumya de miyut Matzui HaMuskar Lemefarshin Zal Besirchot Hareya, like the case of adhesions on the lungs of an animal. Even though we follow generally the majority, and there is no chazaka, there is no presumption of this being aser. Even so, you always have to check the adhesions of the lung of the animal. Miyut matzui, because it is such a prevalent miyut. You know, there's a minority and then there's a minority, right? This is too high. And then he says, but by the way, v'gam bezeh, even in this, davka hecha de'efshar la'amur al speiko b'betika. He says that's only in a case when you actually can check. But if some wolf came and took the entrails away and you didn't get a chance, or maybe entrails is the wrong word if we're trying to also get, I guess, innards, right? We're also trying to get the lung, and it took it away and you didn't get a chance to check. He says it's still kosher, right? So this is really interesting to say that miyud hamatzui has to be something that's almost 50% of the time. There you already see the logic. It's like, we're going to make a distinction. We're going to make a distinction without a difference to say, oh, if it's rove, if it's 50.1% versus 49.8%, okay, there's a legal distinction. And certainly in Halakha, sometimes we do make those kinds of distinctions, right? You have to have a 40 in your mikvah. And if it's missing a little bit of 40 from 40 that's a problem. We don't round up. But here he's basically saying if you're trying to figure out if it might be in there, if it's close to 50%, you have to be choshesh for that, right? Now, it does seem like this chashash is a chashash de rabbanan rather than a chashash de oraita, but maybe you could explain this as either it's a distinction without a difference to go from 45% to 51%, or you could even say that we're kind of worried if you're not going to be choshesh, you're not going to be worried about a miyud hamatzui, maybe at some point you won't be choshesh for a rove either, right? So or maybe at some point it'll become the rove and you won't even notice that it becomes the rove. It's just a little too close. So that's one basic shita. Another basic shita, which shows up in the Mishnah Yaakov, is it's 10% of the time. If it's 10% of the time or more, obviously, that's a miyud hamatzui, and we have to worry about it. Now, by the way, there are people who say that it's even less than 10%, but I want to see where he gets that from. And it seems like where he gets that from, and I'm actually giving the Mishnayot he gets that from, rather than reading through the Mishnah Yaakov, but you can find all this stuff on HebrewBooks.org, and also anybody who's interested in looking at the Halakha Lamasa aspects of this, you can just Google it. This is very easy to find online. But what he says is you have these two Mishnayot, a Mishnah in Bava Batra and a Mishnah in Gittin. The Mishnah in Bava Batra says, HaMocher perot l'chavero, when somebody is selling produce. Let's give an example, or actually, when somebody's selling produce, and then the Mishnah basically says how the customer, how the consumer should assume they will find the produce. Like, is part of it going to be spoiled? Like, in general, what do you assume? It's like when you buy something from IKEA, you kind of always assume that there's going to be a piece missing at some point. There's like two of the same piece, like something replicated or something missing. So in a similar kind of thing, what's the assumed risk that the customer is taking? So let's say it's a martev shel yayin. Let's say we're talking about barrels of wine. So the Mishnah says, mikabel alav eser kosesot lameya. The buyer basically accepts that out of each 100 barrels that are purchased of wine, you can assume probably about 10 of them will be sour, will have turned to vinegar. Okay? That's a 10% rate of turning from wine into soured vinegar. And then you have a Mishnah in Gittin that says, let's talk about, and Mishnah in Gittin is talking about Trumot and Masrot. It's not talking about what Bava Batra is talking about at all. But the Mishnah in Gittin says the following. Let's say somebody says, look, I know at some point I'm going to have to take my truma and my tithes from my fruits and vegetables. And what I'm doing is I'm putting a bunch of, I don't know, let's say in this case, wine. I'm putting a bunch of wine aside. And at some point when I decide I want to separate my truma and I want to separate my masrot, I'm going to verbally basically say that my truma and my masrot come from that section where the wine is, come from that collection of wine. So let's say somebody puts them to the side. So I put them to the side so that I'll know where I'm going to take my truma and maser from, right? So let's say I do that. And by the way, or I put aside ma'ot, I put aside money, liot mafrish and maser sheni. I put aside money in order to be podeh, to redeem my secondary tithes with money. Mafrish alein l'cheskat shehin kayamin. Even if I haven't seen this stuff in a while, whether it's the money case or the wine case, I haven't seen this stuff in a while, I can assume that it still exists. And so I can say verbally somewhere else, I want, name an amount of that wine that I put aside. I want that to be set aside for Trumot and Masrot on all of my wine that I have. And Rabbi Yehuda says, well, actually, b'shlosha prakim bodkin tayayin. If it's wine, there are 3 times over the course of the year that before you assume that whatever wine you put to the side can be used as trumot and masrot on your other wine, you actually have to check. What do you have to check for? That it hasn't turned into vinegar. And he gives 3 times a year when there's a weather change where sometimes the wine can turn into vinegar. Now, the Mishkinot Yaakov looks at this and he says, this is fascinating. We said that out of every 100 barrels of wine, about 10% is going to turn into vinegar. And here, Rabbi Yehuda is saying, you have to check for that 10% because if it's turned into vinegar, you can't use it as trumot and masrot on wine, right? You have to go check to see if it's turned into vinegar. Sounds like a miyud HaMatzui is 10%. Rabbi Yehuda is worried about that 10% chance that it, or I should say the 10%, yeah, I guess we could say that, the 10% chance that it's turned into wine. And therefore, Mishkinot Yaakov says, miyud HaMatzui is 10%. Now, miyud HaMatzui being 10% is also interesting. It's a little bit of a different logic, very different from the logic that says if it's approaching 50%. And here, the logic, first of all, you can say it's not nothing, right? 10% is not nothing. It's something to consider. But I also think basically that logic then for miyud HaMatzui is to basically say we're not trying to hide from the miyud, right? If we can check it, we should check it. We're not trying to hide from it, right? It's a logic of we're not trying to get away with something, right? That's a different kind of logic for a miyud HaMatzui. But I have to say, I think that's the kind of logic the question of whether it has to be close to 50% or it's even if it's 10%, let's go back to the way that we all, as regular people who aren't necessarily slaughtering animals, experience this issue of miyud HaMatzui is washing vegetables. So the Shulchan Aruch in Yoreh De'ah tells us, Kol minei perot shederkan lahatliya kishehem mechubarim, all types of produce that generally get worms, and I'm going to say also get bugs, right, when they are attached to the ground. Lo yochal ad sheyivdok hapri mitocho. Shouldn't eat it until you've checked the inside. Shema yesh bo tolat, because it might have here a worm, but I would also add a bug inside. But the im shia pri achar shen ekar yud chodesh. By the way, if the fruit has been uprooted from the ground for 12 months or more, ochel below bedika, you can actually eat it without checking. Shekol birya she'in ba'etzem eino mitkayim yud bet chodesh, right? Any creature that doesn't have a spine, that doesn't have a skeleton of some sort, doesn't survive more than 12 months. ומכל מקום צריך לבודקן להשליך התולעים הנמצאים ביניהם בחוץ או על גבי הפרי, right? But at any rate, to be honest, you really should clean off the outside and check in between the different fruits to see. But you don't have to check inside, right? Because they're already dead. Okay. Now, I don't know what Eino Mitkayim, right? There's details here of the science and understanding it that I'm not going to go into and I'm not qualified to go into. But I do think it's really interesting that here it really does come into our kitchens, right? And by the way, there's an addition that velo mahani bahem, it's not good enough. We're talking about minei perot, types of fruits, and I'm going to say vegetables is often where we experience this more these days, right? Types of vegetation, it's not good enough im badak harov if you checked the majority of them. El tzarich livdok kulam. You have to check all of them. Tahave miyut deshchiach, because it is a minority that is found often, right? And in fact, I then quote the Rashba's tshuva about, well, can you just check some of them and not all of them? And that's exactly what's being quoted here. No, you have to check all of them. So just to give us a little bit of a balcony view, what's interesting is that this concept of having to check the rhea, the lung of the animal, this concept of having to check your vegetables, the whole concept, or concrete examples, I should say, the whole concept of miut HaMatzui, the prevalent minority, being something that is important halachically and can actually stymie you halachically, and that at the very least you have to check if you can, is generally something that comes to us from the Rishonim and later, comes to us from the medieval commentators and later. So as much as we don't follow Rabbi Meir, who is generally choshesh l'miut, it seems that in certain situations, what evolved was a recognition that something happens with enough regularity that we are actually concerned with it. Now, there are other arenas of halakha where the conversation about miut hamatzui comes up, but I'm going to bracket those because I think when we start to talk about those, there are other issues involved, right? These are both kashrut examples. There are other examples that relate to actually igun and remarriage, right? Getting remarried, knowing that the spouse is dead or not knowing that they're dead. There might be a miut of circumstances where someone could live through whatever it is they say happened to the husband. But maybe we'll leave that for another time. But suffice it to say, in some ways, Rabbi Meir's shita, it doesn't get totally ignored, even if we generally follow the Rove. Thanks, everyone. Looking forward to learning together again next time.